Okay, in this video, I'm going to go over some nodes that I find very useful in Renderman. Some of them are going to hold off until we get to texturing a bit more, but some of these I want to go ahead and start with just because I think it's useful to know. And if you guys do get a head start on doing some texturing stuff, it's great to have these in your tool bag. And as you get more confident in rendering within Renderman, you should really be working in the hypershade as much as you can. You're getting a lot of stuff from Substance Painter, and that's great. You can do most of your texturing work in Substance Painter, but there's a lot of control and a lot of extra flexibility you can get inside of the hypershade. In a lot of cases, you can texture certain assets, including background and environment assets, without even going into Substance Painter if you know what you're doing. Okay, so first ones I want to talk about are the two, or actually the three that I'm probably going to use, I'd say like 85% of the time. And that is going to be the Remap node, the HSL node, and then the Blend node. But first we're going to take a look at the HSL node. So both of these are going to be modifying a color input. So this could be a texture map, or it could be a color or a data input that you're creating in inside the Renderman, like if you're using a noise or something like that. So an HSL is pretty straightforward. Before we go any further, I do want to kind of point this out that this is going to make your life so much easier and make things make so much more sense if you practice this, and that is turning on this solo button. This little S button right here, when you click on it, what it's going to do is it's going to solo that asset in the render viewer, and it's going to give you a good idea of what what that individual component looks like. But that applies to the chain. So if I solo later down the chain, so for instance, this one right here is going to be modifying like the color values, right? It's showing this color, but then going through these two nodes. So keep that in mind. And I don't want to do that, so I'm going to go back. Okay, so I have my color node right here, and so this is what my base diffuse color map is that's coming in looks like. And I'm going to go ahead and isolate and solo this HSL node. So this HSL node is, if you're coming from any program, I mean Substance Painter has one, Photoshop has one, any image editing program is going to have this, and it stands for hue saturation levels, and so, or luminance, I guess. And so what this is going to do is this is going to take your input and it's going to adjust it. So hue is just going to shift it along the color wheel, I guess. Color wheel is what you would call it. It's going to shift along the color wheel, so it's going to tint it. Very rarely are you going to be doing it like drastically. You might like push it a little bit depending on like your environment. So if my environment map is like really blue, like I have blue lights, maybe I might push it a little orange to try to offset that and make it look a little bit more natural or grounded. But you know, it's not very frequent. Saturation is just going to be pushing the saturation. And so if I drop it all the way down to 0, it's going to go fully to just a black and white desaturated texture map. And if I push it higher, it's going to crank it up a little bit more. And I wonder, no, okay, I can't put it higher. I could probably chain another HSL node to push the saturation even more if I really wanted to. So I'll put that back to 1. And then luminance is just going to lighten and darken the entire image. I'm not sure exactly what the image operation that it's doing is to get this. It says it's just scaling it, so it's just scaling the values through there. So yeah, if I was going to be working with the texture in a different environment map, so I might have a different HDR, let me go ahead and load in another one. So here's one where my environment is much more saturated in like a red-purple color. So I might come in here and I might either shift that hue a little bit, so it has a little bit more of that, this is going really slow. Has a little bit more of that, oh, okay, it's there, okay, good. Afraid it might crash or something. So it has a little bit more of that orange tint to it, or yellow tint, so it's kind of cooling off a little bit. And then I can go ahead and drop the saturation just a touch, maybe. So that might give me a lot of control in the per shot. But most of the time, it's just, you know, it looks different in your other program, and either due to color space transformations or something else, it doesn't quite look like what it did in your other program. Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about the Remap node. So I've actually set it up here. I usually use a remap node on most of my texture inputs, just so it gives me an ability to adjust the values of it. Because this remap node is similar to a lot of the color correction nodes like HSL, where you can adjust the values, the brightness and darkness. They all just kind of do it in a slightly different way. The remap node's great for giving you very fine control over all of your values. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to this other example though, because I'm using this remap node to adjust this specular roughness breakup node or texture map. So I'm plugging in this scuff texture map into my Pixar surface. So I'm plugging it into the roughness. So it's breaking that specular up to have looks like something like scuffed it, right? Like sneakers or something like that. And so it's roughing it up. But I want to adjust a little bit more because I don't like how it's overall a little too shiny still. And there's kind of a high contrast. So I'm going to use this Pixar remap node to adjust it. So if you've ever used a Photoshop or Substance Painter, you've probably seen a levels node, right? Or a levels adjustment or a levels filter. In Photoshop, you also have a curves adjustment. So it's going to be doing a histogram adjustment to your values in your scene. So it's going to take the blacks, midtones, and whites, and it's going to essentially remap them to a new value. And that's what the remap comes from. So what I'm going to be doing is showing you guys here. We have the input range, we have our remap operations, and then we have our output range. And so this is us remapping the values that are coming in. So if I take this, I'm going to solo this because it's going to be easier for me to see. And also just as an explanation of why I might use this. So in this case, I have this texture map, and the first thing I should be doing when I bring in this texture map is I should be taking a look at it and seeing if it looks correct. In this case, it does. But then when I look at it on my material, I'm feeling like, oh, it's not doing what I thought it would be doing. You know, those black values are 0 roughness, which means it's super shiny and specular, and I don't want my overall T-bot to be super shiny, right? So I didn't know that. I didn't think about that with those black values. So I'm going to use a remap node to make some adjustments in Renderman so I can see it on the material and see how it's coming along. So that's just kind of like the edge or use case that I'm using it in. So anyways, so what's going to happen is if I take this input min, what happens if I bring this up to higher value, you'll start to see like more and more values are being pushed to black or being pushed down below black. And what this is saying is my 0.2 pixel values, so like a really dark gray, are now being set to being black. So anything below 0.2 is being crushed to black, and everything above 0.2 is adjusting accordingly between 1 and 0.2. So now instead of our range being from 0 to 1 for our pixel values, black to white, our range is actually from 0.2 to 1, and it's setting that 0.2 to be black. And the white is the same thing, right? If I bring the values down lower, then what's happening, let's set that back to 0, is it's now saying the 0.42 value is now being white, and everything above it is also being clamped to white. So that's kind of what's going on. I might be oversimplifying it or not explaining it very well, but that's generally what's happening. The remap nodes are going to adjust the midtones, and they're usually, to some degree, they're going to be adjusting the midtones without affecting the blacks and the white values, so the ends of the curve. Here's a visual demonstration. So here we have our essentially our curve for our value distribution. So here's the input color and here's the output color. And so you can think of it as black to white. And it's mapping the black of the input to the black of the output. So if essentially I look at this with a graph, and I'm looking at this purple line right here. So my black values, if I look up on here, purple is where that line is, it's also 0. So black goes to 0. And then if it's the 25% white value or gray value is also outputting as the 25% white or gray value. And then white goes to white, so on. So it's just a linear mapping, so there's no change. There's nothing changing between the input and changing between the output. But a gamma correction and a gain correction are going to do something like this, where they're going to grab that mid curve and they're going to push it around. And usually the ends are left unchanged, so you still have the full range from black to white. It's just what's happening in the middle is kind of changing a bit more. So let's go ahead and close that. So I'll come back out here. So we have this bias and gain, so it's kind of like a similar similar color correction as a gamma correction. And you can always highlight over these and it'll tell you a bit more about what specifically it's going to do. So this one's a gamma correction right here. So as I push this higher, it's going to take all those midtone values and push them brighter and brighter and brighter, right? And closer to white. but you'll probably notice that those black values are still there, so it's still keeping that value range. And then gain's pretty similar, but it just does it in a slightly different way. So this kind of starts crushing those values, but again, keeping that color range, but doing a different mid-range value adjustment. So it has a different distribution. So there's that gain brought down dark, and here's that gain bias brought down dark. So they just have a different kind of shape to that curve adjustment that they do to the values. And if you ever want to set those back to their default, you just go in here and you can just set it to 0.5. So they should just be at 0.5 for default. Okay. Then the output min and max is just going to be so you can clamp the values. So right now, we can see we have going from black to white. If I brought the output max down, then I'm not going to have any values higher than 0.2. So we're not remapping our pixel values to black and white. We're actually remapping our black and white values to a new value. So it's really good for like clamping and keeping it from essentially going higher or lower than a certain value. And if I can do the same thing with the black right here, right? So as I'm raising it, no values are going to be lower than this value right here. So anyways, so why would you want to use this? So like I said earlier, we have these texture map values here, and I'm using them in my specular roughness. And my specular roughness goes from 0 to 1, where 0 is glossy and 1 is fully rough. So what's happening here is wherever there's black pixels, it's 0, which means it's super shiny. There's no roughness. So what I might want to do is I might want to go ahead and bring that min up. So by bringing that min up, I'm going to set the lowest possible roughness value to be a higher number. So it won't be any less rough than a certain value. So as I bring that up, you'll start to see those black values are starting to be clamped up. And then I can come over here, solo that, and we can take a look at this texture. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to frame render right here. So you can see as I bring that up, let's set that back down to 0. Right, it's not affecting the top value, it's affecting so that those white scuffs, they're still white scuffs. And so if I bring that up, then my lowest possible roughness is getting higher and higher and higher, which is making my image more rough, or my reflections more rough. And if I didn't want that to be so rough right there, those scuff marks, I could bring that down lower. And so I'm not going to get quite so rough of those scuff marks. It's essentially fully rough. Okay, so I'm going to bring it up a little bit, maybe not too much. Okay, so I could also bring up the average mid-tone area. So I like those high scuff marks, but I also kind of want to play with that mid-value range. So I'm going to use this bias value. So if I bring that bias value up, everything more or less is going up towards being rough, because the higher and lighter the image is, the more rough it looks. And if I want really just those scuff marks to be rough and I want them sharper, then I can bring that contrast lower. So I'm going to have really sharp marks there. And we'll come over here so we can see that. So bring that higher, bring that lower. And let's set that back. Okay. And really, I think of the input range when I use it as thinking of it like contrast. So the more they're like just their original values, the lower contrast they are. You can bring them further apart from each other. So I can make the input min less and the input max higher, and I'm gonna get a lower contrast effect, right? So we're gonna have lower contrast image. We'll set that to 1. And if I bring them closer together, you're gonna start to notice they're gonna be higher and higher contrast, right? And so it's having a more stark difference between the dark and light values. And if I brought this value right here back lower again, you'd start to really notice it. So let's turn that on. So by bringing those input values closer together, we get this higher contrast effect. And if I set that back to their default values, then we have a lot lower contrast. Okay, so that's the basics of the Remap node. I actually talked about it for a surprisingly long time, but it's probably the most useful node you can use probably in the Hypershade for Renderman. And it's a little unintuitive, I think, in my opinion. I wish it actually just looked like a normal levels node and I could do like a levels adjustment or a curves adjustment. But once you get a hang of it and what it's doing, most importantly though is soloing, because especially when you're not plugging things straight into color and you're plugging into some other attribute, it's actually not very easy to tell what's going on. But remember, you gotta think of these non-color texture maps as data. So it's plugging into a particular attribute. if you know what those values in the attribute do, so 0 being shiny and 1 being rough, then I can know at this texture map, white being 1 being rough and black being 0 or shiny, I can kind of get a sense of, like, oh, if I want to make this not super shiny, I'm going to raise the input min so I don't have any black values. So now it's all relatively rough. And then I want a little bit higher contrast, so I'm going to bring those black and white values closer together. And then we end up with results like this. Cool, so hopefully that part makes sense. Okay, for this next example, I want to show you guys another super useful node, probably my third most used node in Renderman, and that is the blend node. And I'll show you some variations of the blend node, but the one I use the most is just the blend node. The blend node does is it mixes two colors together using a certain Photoshop operation. So if you're familiar with Photoshop and also the blend mode, layer blend modes in Substance Painter, then you'll probably start to recognize these. So these are these operations here, and what they do is they take the top color and then they do a certain operation with the bottom color. So if I take a look at this, let's go ahead and I'll create a new blend node and I'll show you guys what that kind of looks like. Phasor blend. Okay, so it could either accept the input or you just set the colors yourself. So I'm going to just plug this into a random attribute so I can see the node soloed. So just keep that in mind. If you don't have any of your nodes plugged into your end shader, if you do that solo mode, you actually can't see it. Okay, so I come over here and I'm going to set this color to being red and I'm going to set this color to being blue. So normal is just going to be an overlaying operation. So it's essentially the top layer is going to sit completely on top of the bottom layer, right? And then we have all these different operations here, and I'm going to show you maybe one or two of them, but really what I encourage you to do is take a look at either watching a video on the Photoshop blend nodes or taking a look at what the different, oh, this is Remap, blend, here we go, Phasor blend. So here they describe in detail what each operation is going to do to colors and values. So just know your normal operation is going to be just the top layer sitting on the bottom layer. So let me go ahead and show you. Let me hide that. Minimize. Okay. So when we, by default with the I'm going to have to start over again. So for this next node, I want to show you is probably my second most used node behind, or third most used node behind the HSL node and the Remap node, and that is the blend node. So the blend node is going to take two inputs, color inputs or texture inputs, I guess still color, and it's going to perform an operation on them or let you layer them on top of each other like you would in Photoshop or Substance Painter. So right here, I'm just soloing this, so I'm just looking purely at this node right here, the color node, or this blend node. And so what I'm doing is I have a top layer and a bottom layer, top color, bottom color. And right now I'm not inputting any textures, I'm just using color. So the top one's red, bottom one's blue. Right now, we just see the top color, which is red, and that is due to this normal operation. And all of these are going to be essentially blending modes if you've ever used Photoshop, or blending modes in Substance Painter as well with layers. So it's how you combine one layer with a layer beneath it in a way other than them just sitting on top of each other. If you want to look these up, and I would encourage you guys to do so, if you don't know what they are, then I encourage you to look up the documentation for it. Let me bring it up right now. So here we go. And so they have on their page a handy demonstration of what those blending modes do, how it combines those two colors together. There's also videos online you can look up. You just Google blending modes, you can see videos where people break it down. And it's something that you really should get, if you're going to do any surfacing work, you really should kind of understand what blending modes are. They're very helpful. Okay, so I'm not going to really get into the blending modes themselves because it's not specific to this program. I'm going to kind of show you guys the other part of it. So here we have our top color, bottom color, our blending mode. And so in this case, it's normal. So they're just the top layer is sitting completely over the bottom layer. And then we have these alphas. So the alpha is essentially going to be blending between the operation of the top layer on top of the bottom layer. So right now we just have an overlay, or sorry, not overlay, an over or normal operation. And so when I bring this alpha down, it's essentially giving like a 50-50% mix between these. It's essentially turning this half off, and we're seeing the other half of the pixel being the blue, or that bottom layer. And so if I did other things like, I guess I did a screen operation where it's actually combining those together, you can think of this as like the opacity for that blending operation. So you can think of it as just controlling how much that top layer is visible on top of the other layer. And then here's multiply, which is going to be darkening. And again, here I'm just going ahead and using that alpha slider right there. Let's go ahead and set that back to normal. Okay. There's a bottom alpha too, which is again going to control the visibility of that bottom layer, but you really don't have to worry about that. We're mostly concerned about the top alpha. Okay, let me go ahead and I'm going to disconnect this one for now. I'll actually delete it. So in this example here, I'm pulling in a mask. So I'll go ahead and solo that. It's just a mask for those words hello. And I'm actually plugging them into different material attributes. So first I have that teapot color. So it has like my wood diffuse color map that I created. And what I'm doing is I'm actually wanting to take the hello and I'm going to make it like gold, as if someone put like gold flakes in it or something like that. So what I'm doing here is because it's going to be gold-like, I actually want that this interior, that text, to have a black diffuse to it, because I do not want if it's going to be a metallic, it shouldn't have a diffuse color to it. So what I'm doing here is I set the top color to be black, right? And then on my bottom color is actually my diffuse map. And so what I'm doing is I'm putting the black on top of, here, let's disconnect this, break connection. So I'm putting this black on top of my diffuse map, and I'm using this mask right here to essentially only have that black show up on the hello parts, the word. So I set that on top, and now that black that was covering everything is now only covering the hello. Okay, so that's one really straightforward way of using it, just combining colors together, and more importantly though, in this situation, using a mask to change between those values. And on the bottom one, I'm using it on that same mask on the different material attribute. So same thing, because I'm wanting the text to be gold, I want the diffuse to be black, right? Because it's no longer dielectric, and it needs to have a different reflective property. So dielectric's going to have a really low face specular color. So in this case, it's about 3% reflectance. But then I want the gold to be almost 100%, right? Because metals are way more reflective than dielectrics. So again, I'm going to be plugging, I want to modulate or modify this specular face color too. So I'm taking, again, another blend mode, and for the bottom color, I'm setting the specular face color for my dielectric, which is 3%, 0.03. And for my top color, I'm getting a really high tinted color value for that gold. Let's color manage it. There you go. So it's much brighter and it's saturated. I could also just make it like chrome or silver, right? But in this case, I thought it looked cooler with gold. So this is something that I think a lot of people overlook with the Pixar blend node is not only can you blend colors, but you can also blend different attributes. And I am actually using a 0 to 1. Again, it's 0 to 1, but right now that's because it's clamped, and I could actually use a Pixar blend, right? And I could go ahead and actually unclamp them, and I can actually set those colors to being higher than 1. So if I wanted, my range was from 0 to 2, right? I could go set this to 2, and it really depends on what that attribute it is, right? So like an index or a fraction is set usually from 1 to a much higher number, you know. Usually you're not going to go much higher than like 2.4 or something like that. So I would want to actually use a value that's not 0 to 1. I'd want a different value. There's other ways you can do that, but I think the Pixar blend node is really handy for that reason. Let's take a look at these other ones. Mixing, here we go. So we have our blend node, and we also have a much simpler node, which is the Pixar mix node. So the Pixar mix node is going to be mixing 2 colors again, and they can be inputs, but it's just using a percentage mixer value, so it's losing that operation mode. So you could honestly, the things I just showed you guys, you could just use the mix node. You wouldn't have to use a blend node. I personally just like the blend node because it has that operation effect that you can add to it. So I can blend, take those two layers and actually blend them together instead of just overlaying them on top and setting a percentage of what's visible and what's not visible. But if you're simply just masking between two maps, then the mix node is totally fine. And then we have this Phasor layered blend. And so this would be like, instead of, if I had like 6 different masks and I wanted to change the color between each for like 6 different areas on my model, instead of having to bring in 5 different blend nodes and daisy chain them together, this just essentially lets you combine a bunch of blend nodes together and set their alpha value and blending modes together. And you just want to go ahead and start enabling them based on which ones you're using. It's a little overkill most of the time. Like, you're probably not going to use this very often, but it's there if you want to have a bunch of blending operations together. For these nodes, I didn't want to kind of set up a demonstration for all of them because it gets a little repetitive, but I did want to kind of point them out so you guys know if you know what you're looking for, that you can grab them. So these are all going to be color adjustment, color correction nodes on top of the HSL and Remap. These are also options you have. So we have the Phasor Gamma, which is going to be doing a gamma adjustment. We have Phasor Exposure, which is going to be adjusting the values in an exposure method. So if you're used to like exposure and stops, essentially it's going to be doubling the and halving your values. So if you're used to that, you can use the Phasor Exposure, or you know exactly why you're using that. Phasor Black Body, I covered this in a previous video, but it's essentially outputting a color value based on the theoretical black body, ideal black body that you heat up. And so it's like a black metal, and it's this theoretical idea that you heat up this black metal, and depending on the temperature, it changes to this specific color within this color range here. It's often used in lighting. So whenever you see that Kelvin, like 3500 Kelvin, that means that would be the color that black metal would look like if it was heated up to 3500 Kelvin. It's just used in lighting scenarios. And again, it's another one of those situations where if you know what you're doing, you could totally use it. And I used it previously showing the doing incandescent light bulb with an emission. You have your color grade, which is essentially going to let you have controls for shadows, mids, and highlight colors, so you can adjust the colors in different areas or value ranges. You have your color correct, which is going to be doing a lot of classic color adjustments. And so again, like all these other ones, I recommend you guys look up the documentation. They're going to tell you exactly what different nodes do. This one is, if you're used to using a color correct node like in Nuke, it's going to have a lot of those controls, including a gamma adjustment and contrast, which can do a lot of the stuff that Remap does. So if you think the color correct is easier to use, you could totally use that instead of using the Remap node. And then the Phasor Color Space is a fairly new node. I just want to point it out is when you guys are using OCIO, so something like ACES for managing your color spaces, Renderman now has the ability for you guys to adjust from one color space to another or convert between them without having to go through another program like Nuke. Next, I wanted to talk about my pattern nodes. So these are going to be structured patterns, and then we're going to talk about the noise. And so these are going to be procedural generation tools we can use inside this node network to create images. So instead of bringing in a texture, I can use one of these to create data input, like image-based data input that I could use. And so you could do a lot of texturing work without having to leave the program and going into Photoshop. So the first one, or Substance Painter, the first one, or Mari, okay, sorry. So the first one I want to talk about is a ramp node, and I'm doing it on this plane because it's a little bit easier to show, but we can apply it to a 3D object, and I'll show you that in a second. So essentially, if you've used the Maya ramp, it's the same idea. It's just a gradient. It gives you a bunch of options for creating different gradients. In this case, what I'm doing is have this blend node from blue to pink. Let's just go ahead and disconnect that. So blue is my top color and pink is my bottom color. And if I change that alpha value, I'm adjusting between them. And so I'm going to be using these maps to control when the top color is shown and when the bottom color is shown. So I'll plug that there. So, and if I look at this map, this is what it looks like. So it's going from white to black. And so it's using that as a mask, going from blue to pink. Okay, so on this ramp node, we have our S ramp, which is our left to right ramp. We have our T ramp, which is our up and down ramp. And this is according to the texture space. So not always in the case when we switch this to a 3D mode. You can think of it like X and Y, or left and right and up and down. But a lot of times when people say S and T, it's going to be applying to the texture coordinates. We have diagonal, which is going to be blending between the two of them. We have radial, which is going to be doing like a kind of like a clock rotation from a start point to an end point. We have circular, which is going to be a radial ramp that I'm usually used to thinking of when I think of radial ramp. So it's a circular ramp going from the middle out to the sides. We have box, which is going to be kind of like the previous one, but it has a linear or boxy kind of shape to it. Four corner. I actually don't think I've ever used four corner. This one is very interesting, and I'm not going to worry about it. And then random object color is not relevant here, but if you had multiple objects, you could set up a gradient ramp. And what random object color would do is if you've set up a way that they can, each object can grab a different color, or whatever system you're using, it will actually sample from your gradient map. So if I had like specific colors and I wanted each object to be a randomized color, it would choose that randomized color from this gradient I've created instead of just any color that's possible. This next node is my checker node. So essentially it's going to create a checkerboard pattern. And so if I set this to having a higher dimension, I think the default should be 2. It is going to give you a checkerboard pattern where it's giving you alternating black and white squares, you know, based on this pattern. And it's pretty straightforward, you know. It has a third, let's just get that color. It actually has a third dimension here. So if I go here, I can bring it up to 3. We're actually not going to see that because that's going to be in the Z dimension. And we'll get to that in a second when we talk about the manifolds. But essentially that's going to give me more control. And we're also going to see how we can repeat this, right? Because this is only 4 squares, 2 by 2 dimension squares. That's not super exciting. I would like more than that. But we'll take a look at that again when we look at the manifolds in a second. And then the last one we're going to take a look at here is going to be the grid node. Let me go bring that up. And so it's going to essentially give me a grid shape on here with lines for borders. So the way this one works is we're essentially going to be creating a grid pattern, and you have 2 types. You have your rectangular and you have your hexagonal. I think the hexagonal one's really exciting, but either way, so we can use this. I'm getting ahead of myself. So the first thing you're probably going to adjust is that border thickness. So that border thickness is going to be the thickness of our cells of our grid pattern. And then what we're going to do is by setting the width and height, we're going to get repeating tiles. So if I get, right now it's set to 1 to 1, so it's mapped to the full square, my full UV space. If I set this to a lower value, then what it's going to do is it's actually going to start repeating. So let's do 0.2. So now I'm getting lines going this way. If I do 0.2 in the width way, now I'm getting more grids in this direction as well. So it's great for just creating like a linear pattern here. Let's set that to 0.05. A linear grid pattern, so lines like this. So if you're making tiles, you could, there's another way I would make tiles, but you could theoretically use this to make tiles. So it's super cool. And if I've set this higher than 1, just to let you guys know, it's actually going to stretch it outside of the UV space. So keep that in mind. So if I set it to 0.12, it's actually stretching off. So we'll set that back to 1. And then with the hexagonal, right, it's just going to create a hexagon, which I think is pretty dang cool. I know there's a team in my current Vertical Studio class that is doing these, and so they should probably take a look at that. So that's the grid. It's super straightforward like the checker in a nutshell. I'm going to go ahead and mention the invert node. This is a good time. And essentially the invert node is going to do exactly what you think. You could do a Pixar remap. I'm going to show you really quickly. So in the Pixar remap node, we're going to take a look at this inputs, RGB, and then we're going to take that color and plug it in here. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at this remap node. So this is what that grid pattern looks like. You can actually invert by bringing the output min up to 1 and the output max down to 0, and you can actually input your image. So if you're using a remap node already and you do want to invert it, you could technically do that. But you could also just use a invert node and it'll do pretty much the exact same thing. So that's just going to invert your colors. And you can choose to invert only certain color channels for some reason. I'm sure there's reasons, but that's just there. So that's just the invert node. I did want to drop that in now while we're talking about these patterns. Okay, I want to go ahead and talk about those manifolds. So we have here, I'm just going to be covering the 2D and 3D manifold. There's a lot of other options, and there's also ways. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but essentially a manifold is going to be a way that you can adjust how transform the image in that image's texture space. So if it's in the 2D texture space, like UV based with the 2D manifold, then what it's going to do is it's going to scale it in the UV space, which is controlling the size of the image when it wraps on the model. And you can scale, offset, rotate. You can do all kinds of transformation values. And then 3D is if you're going to be using some kind of 3D space based projection system or procedural node. So for instance, when we were looking at that Phasor checker earlier, remember it has those 3 dimensions, but you can see that 3rd dimension. It actually can create a texture pattern in all 3 dimensions on your model, and we'll take a look at that first. So, or in a second. So let's first take a look at the 2D manifold. So right now this is purely UV based, so it's going to be essentially doing this on a flat plane and then going onto my model. Actually, let's look at this on the plane. That makes more sense. Here we go. It'll work on the teapot, but probably makes a little bit more sense showing it on this thing. All right, so we have here our angle, which is going to be essentially... Oh, I had to cut that because I had figured out what was wrong with my Maya, or Renderman. So this happens often if you're trying to make an adjustment and the render display is not updating correctly or not showing what you think is supposed to be there. Sometimes that's an issue with IPR and you just have to restart the render. So in my case, I literally just restarted the render and then my changes were showing up all of a sudden. Okay, so great. So that means I can actually start showing how this works. So angle is going to be just rotating our 2D texture. Frequency is going to affect how it stretches or repeats. So essentially frequency is going to be stretching it. And then when it's stretched smaller than its UV space, the texture, it starts to repeat. So if I just set this, let's set that angle back to 0. If that sets it to 1, right? Once I set that back to 2, you'll see it's going to start repeating. So this is how we can get more checkers with our Phasor checkerboard, right? And I can set that super high. So I can set that to 28 to 20, right? To get really small checkers. Let's set that back to 2. Offset's just going to be offsetting the texture, and I'm doing this on these procedural nodes. You could do this on the Phasor texture node, so you can bring in a texture map and you can scale and like let's say you brought in a tileable texture, like I was doing on my where is it? This one right here, where I had that smudgy texture that I was bringing in. You could use I'm using a different type of manifold, but you could use a 2D manifold and scale it and then get it to repeat. So you can actually make it smaller and bigger, just like you would in Substance Painter, like if you just wanted to scale your procedural texture. Okay, let's go back to those examples. All right. And so it's just going to be offset in the X and Y direction, or the S and T direction if you're thinking of the texture space. You can plug in a texture map for warping. Let me see what that looks like in a second. It's not something you're going to do a whole lot, but it lets you kind of give like a warp distortion like you would in Designer. But let's go ahead and see what that looks like really quickly. So here I'm applying a fractal noise. So this is what the fractal noise is. Take a look at like this shape right here in particular. And we can see that having an effect on our coordinates of our texture. And so it's going to displace our texture based on that warp input map. So it's something that you can add in, like let's say you really liked a noise pattern that you found in here, but you wanted extra little detail or crunch to it, like it just didn't have just enough detail or fine grit. You can plug in another noise, or you can plug in a texture map that you load in to give it a little bit of offset and a little bit extra tooth. And then on that manifold node, we can just bring that warp amount down. So you can get it to just maybe wiggle it a little bit just to make it just slightly off kilter. So not something I don't know if I would use it very often, but it definitely has some really interesting uses that you could think up for it. Okay, let's look at this on our 3D object. So I have that 2D node, and so again, it's going to be adjusting our texture map in the 2D space. And so on this procedural node, because it's a 2D map, and it could also be used 3D, it's going to be essentially doing the same thing it was doing on that square, or that plane, but it's doing it in a, it's doing it like as if it was doing it on a flat surface, and then it's wrapping it onto my 3D model. And so let's take a look at that also with the ramp node. And this might be a little kind of redundant or feel really redundant, but I just wanted to kind of make this differentiation for the 2D manifold and what we're going to look at next, which is the 3D manifold. So the 3D manifold, let's go ahead and bring that up. And I might have to restart my render. Let me see if that worked. And I figured out what I did wrong. Essentially, I was plugging in the message into the manifold, but I wanted to plug in the result into the manifold. So now it's essentially it's ignoring our UVs coordinates, and it's actually applying this texture in 3D space. This wouldn't necessarily work with your texture map because these nodes are set up to also be generated in 3-dimensional space too. So I just wanted to show this. And on certain nodes that you're using, I think maybe round cube, Pixar round cube, you could also adjust 3D space coordinates of your texture map. So here, essentially it's going to just give me scale control, and it's going to kind of act like the frequency, right? So it's just operating in that 3-dimensional space. We can actually change the coordinate system. So if you hover over here, it says coordinate system, you can type in a different one. So right now it's an object space. Let's do world space. So it's essentially looking at the world coordinates instead of the local coordinates. Let's set that back to 0. And let's just slightly increase it. Oh yeah, it increases super fast. There we go. And then we can do screen space. So we can do screen. And so it's actually, let's set that to 0. So it's actually doing our ramp from left and right on our screen. So if I move that ramp position, I set that scale to 0. Let's set that scale to 1. Oh, I don't think I'm supposed to do 0. Set that to 1. And so I come back in here and I can adjust that, and it's adjusting this based on the screen space. So that's pretty cool. Let me show you guys also on the Pixar checker. And let's go ahead and make sure our checker, I'm going to set this back to object. Okay. And so now I can add that 3rd dimension. So first let's go ahead and change that scale. So let's go ahead and bring it down smaller. So you can see it's projecting it in 3D space. And if I just had a single dimension, right, it's going to be kind of like linear stripes. Then I get 2 dimensions. And then we add 3 dimensions. So it's also projecting it. It's projecting from the top, from the side, and from the front and from the side. So yeah, the manifolds are really helpful for you adjusting your texture maps based on what type of texture map it is. If it's an actual like 2D texture map, or you want your procedural nodes to act like a 2D wrap and go in the UV space, you can use that Pixar Manifold 2D. And if you have like some kind of 3-dimensional procedural node that you're using, you can use the Manifold 3D. Okay, next I'm going to talk about the noise generators. So this is a way that we can procedurally generate texture inputs based on these different noise patterns or these noise functions. And so each of these are going to have a lot of procedural controls to them, and you can play around with them quite a bit. They all have their unique little variables and control parameters, and they're not something that's really easy to remember or intuit out of just looking at it and reading it. I wholeheartedly encourage you guys to just plug this into something and play around with it, right? So in this example here, I just set up a layered material between a black material and a gold material. I'm just using this noise to control the layering between those two materials, and I'm also, just for fun, plugging into a displacement so it's pushing and creating geometry too. And so I'm getting these really funky patterns and interesting looks to it. So like I said before, I would encourage you guys to play around with these parameters because you can get a lot of variation out of just one noise node. I'm actually going to disable that displacement because that is kind of expensive if I'm trying to update this real time for you guys. So let's go ahead and start with actually modify this one. So I'm going to go ahead and drop in a new fractal noise. So the Pixar fractal noise is going to be kind of like what you guys would associate as a color noise if you are using, or sorry, not color noise, a cloud noise inside of Substance Painter. And so it's going to have this kind of cloudy kind of fall off to it. And so and it looks like it is not updating, so let me make sure that I'm going to restart my render, and hopefully there we go. Okay, if it stops updating, just keep that in mind. You might need to restart your render. So it's going to give you your basic kind of cloudy noise. And like I said, I'm not going to go over all these settings. I don't remember what all those settings are. You guys don't want to watch me play around with this for another hour. I just recommend you guys check them out. But generally speaking, the one you're going to notice the most is layers or octaves often are going to be essentially the layering of your texture, like how many values it's going to have, how many layering of that noise it's going to have, or depth. And then the frequency is often going to be the scale. So it's how much it can, how big or small it is until it starts repeating. And if you can set this higher, but then at that stage it starts to actually kind of disappear because it's all blending together. But let's set it back down to a lower value. A lot of them have different types, so it's just like a different way of generating using the same function but with slightly different parameters to get a different look. So we have simplex, which is going to be kind of like this cell-y looking one, like an actual organic cell bumps. Gabor, which is pretty similar to Perlin, but it's just like just a different shape. You can see it even has different settings to it, right? So they all have their own unique settings, and the only way you're going to know about it is if you try it out and see what it looks like. And then you have your cell noise, which is going to be your randomized squares with different values. So let's set that back to Perlin. And then even this one has its own unique setting, like the turbulent, which is changing that fall off for those values between the peaks and troughs. So yeah, that's the basic of the Pixar Fractal. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Pixar Worley. So we'll bring that down to here. And I'm going to have to isolate this one. Here we go. So this one's going to give you kind of like this scale, like it's used, Worley is used, or this like kind of cell pattern is used a lot for like bubbles, like there's like a boundary between bubbles or cracks or fractures in a shell, right? And so it gives you these essentially these randomized geometric squares are all kind of fitting into each other. So again, frequency is going to be how many there are, right? It's going to scale them down, right? And again, I can push that past, so I'm going to set that to 10, right? And then jitter is usually like a randomization feature. So with 0, you can see it's now going down to being 2D. And let's go ahead and get this to wrap 2D. So just like we mentioned before with our manifolds, we can attach a 2D manifold to get this to behave in a 2D space on a UV space, and then 3D on a 3D space. So by default, it's acting in a 3D space. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this, and we're just going to attach that 2D manifold. So we're going to do Pixar manifold 2D. Okay, and it shifted a lot of my nodes. That's cool. So let me go ahead and pause this and readjust. There we go. Okay, so it's going to be adjusting this on that 2D space instead of that 3D space. So all we're doing is just making it map in the UV space. So again, I've set that jitter down to 0. It's going to have a regular grid pattern to it. And I can still give some, this is going to be the color difference between the two different colors. There is a way to set this so they have a randomized value. And again, I don't want you guys to have to watch me do this. So let's set this back to jittering and then set this to a lower frequency and play with these values. So this is clearly going to be affecting those colors of blending between them. It's kind of cool. You actually feel like it's getting a kind of like a raised craggy rock pattern. Let's see what that looks like when I plug into the displacement. So here we go. So yeah, it kind of has like this rock, kind of like a cobblestone pattern to it. So it's pretty cool. Let me go ahead and disconnect that again because that's super expensive. Okay, there we go. So again, not going to go into this. Just again, I encourage you guys to play around with this and try each of these nodes to see what they're like, because you can get some really interesting results with just changing a few parameters. And like I said, if you like something, like let's say I really liked what I had set up right here, I'm just going to save a preset of that and just name it. So we'll call this one cobblestone and save. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and move on to the Voronoise. Actually, I want to recreate this Worley because I want those default settings. And I'm actually going to show you guys something before we move on to the other one, which is another node. I was saving it for when we were looking at the noise because I thought it would be most useful when we're looking at the noise patterns. So this node is going to be the clamp node. And I think I want to use it on this one. I might want to use it on, that's fine. We'll use it on this one. All right, so the clamp node, what this one does is it's going to do exactly what it sounds like. It's going to clamp your input And so that anything above or below a value is clamped or essentially cut off, and everything below that value is erased or disappeared. So if I set this input RGB here and plug that into that chain, so here's our input. We have white to black. So if I bring that black value up, you'll see that it's going to, let's take a look at the clamp map. So you'll see that it's actually going to be essentially raising the floor, and everything that is darker than this value here is getting erased away. And we can do it in the opposite direction too. So let's go and pull that down. So now I only have these spots. And then, you could use that remap node to get it into a value range that is useful to you. So let's go back over here. And so if I wanted it to be, again, from white to black, I can just go ahead and adjust that value range so it goes from white to black, and using that remap node. And there you go. I just wanted to bring up that clamp node. It's really useful for when you're using these noises to get isolate certain aspects of it. And yeah. One more node I wanted to bring up too while we're here that's related to the Pixar clamp node or similar to it is the threshold node. Threshold. So it's going to do a similar operation where it's going to be clamping our values based on an input. So in this case, instead of having like a max and min, what it's going to do is it's going to find somewhere between black and white, and it's going to clamp the values to either being any value that's above it's going to be white, and any value below it's going to be black. So let's go and take a look at that. Let's set this to a lower value. So let's set it to 0.2. So we look at this map image right here. Oop, here we go. We have our pixel values, right? And you can see I got this pixel readout that's telling me what the values are. And so I'm setting it to 0.2. So anything that's darker than 0.2 is going to go to black, and anything brighter than 0.2 is going to go to white. So here, let's take a look at that. It's 0.22. So here we go. So it's clamping based on that value. So you can use this threshold value to set that midpoint. We also have this transition width, which is going to give you kind of like a softer fall off or a harder fall off, depending on what you want. So both of these are really cool. They're not something that might be the first thing you think of, but again, combined with those noise and these nodes, you can get some really interesting results. Okay, next we have Voronoise. You'll see it's very similar in some ways to the Fractal and the Worley. And just like the Fractal and Worley and that checkerboard and the ramp node, we can plug in a 2D or 3D manifold to control the shape. So right now it's kind of doing a 3D projection, so I could plug in that 2D manifold if I wanted to be wrapped around the teapot in a 2D way. Much like the Fractal and the Worley, it's going to have very similar behaviors and looks. In this case, we have our frequency. Remember, it's going to be our scaling. We have our octaves, which is going to be essentially our layers. It has a gain function, which is going to be adjusting the brightness, and it is not updating. Let me restart the IPR again. Oh, it was working. I just wasn't using the right settings. So when it was at octaves 1, the gain wasn't changing, but when you have more octaves, that gain starts to come into effect. And much like the Worley, you have that jitter, which is going to give you like that cell noise pattern. And this one has actually a smoothness feature, which blends between them, and it starts to actually look like a fractal noise. And you even have that turbulent, which gives you, just like on the Fractal, that turbulent mode right there, where you get this kind of specific pattern. So nothing really special here, just another noise pattern, nothing that we haven't seen yet. Okay, for this last noise, I wanted to take a look at Phasor noise. This one's very new. It's very robust, it's large. It's great for creating very organic looking patterns. And so it has a lot of power to it. It's very interesting, and I've played around with it a lot and I've had a lot of fun with it. We're not going to go deep into it again, of course. I don't want this to be forever video. I'm just going to show you one example. So here they use the Phasor noise to create a wood grain pattern. So really cool, really interesting results that you can get from it. And so just going to show you a few settings. So we have, in this case, you can actually have it, we can plug an input manifold into it, and you can switch between 3D and 2D mode. We can get different directions it can align in. We can get it to, let me go ahead and make sure I reset this. Okay, I figured out what I did wrong. We don't need to get super far into it, but essentially, we have this align mode, which lets me change the direction of the mapping or projection of my this pattern. So we can do linear X. You can see it's going from X direction, the Y direction, the Z direction, and other types of align modes. And so it's just this value right here is direction align. And so that just lets you be able to do that. So let's go ahead and turn that on. So I'm going to do that align linear Y. So we have our frequency, right, which is again how much it repeats. We have all these different direction and jitter values, right? So we can actually play with these jitter values, which is just anytime you see jitter, it's usually going to be a randomization. I'm not going to really mess around with it too much. Down here is where you're going to find most of the settings that are going to change the look of that pattern. That and then also this shape. So let's actually hide this. So the shape is going to be the fall off between the black and the white, right? So right now it's a sine mode. I can use a sawtooth, pulse, Gabor sine. We could go ahead and use our own spline. So you can set up your own gradient, right? Your own ramp between the values. I'm just going to set it back to sine. And then this setting right here is going to be the one that I think you get a lot of that texture variation from. So you just change this kernel frequency. So by increasing the kernel frequency, you're kind of increasing the number of times it's performing this operation. Again, just like frequency in a lot of cases. We can play around with the scale. We can play around with the neighbors. So the more neighbors you have, the larger an area it's considering. So it's going to smooth out the effect quite a bit. And so again, just like all the other noises, we kind of have to play around with a lot of these settings to kind of discover something new about this. And then down here with octaves is really going to be playing with like that dimensionality of that noise and how that's affecting it. So you can get some really, really weird and interesting and funky stuff with it. So again, I don't want to get too far into this because there's a few more things I wanted to talk about, not too much more, but just wanted to show you that. And I'm just, again, encourage you guys to plug this in to something cool on your shader and mess around with it and see what you get. And you can get some really fun and exciting results with just a single noise node, or noise node. Okay, for this next set of nodes, these are going to be my mesh-based nodes. So they're going to calculate a mask based on, or I guess an image input, based on my geometry, like the shape of my model, which direction the polygons are facing, etc., etc. So to show this, I just have two nodes set up, blend nodes. This first one is going to be just blending between a dirt color. Let's get something like a little bit darker, maybe a little less saturated. And then my base material, which is like this black gray shiny plastic. Okay, and then I'm also plugging this in the roughness. So by default it's shiny, but in the dirt areas I want it to be rougher. Okay, so we're gonna start with the dirt. It's gonna essentially have a prejudice or a desire to be identifying our cavity areas. So the areas where dirt would be collecting. So we're going to take this input right here. I'm going to plug that into the color and plug that into the roughness. And we're going to go ahead and solo this just so we can see it better. So here's what it looks like. We have, let's set this to inside, outside. Oh, this is a previous version. I need to restart IPR again. Here we go. So keep that in mind. Sometimes it doesn't clear whatever it has in memory and you have to restart IPR. So here we go. So this is what it looks like by default. You can see it's detecting like the cavity areas, like kind of like ambient occlusion. So these three values are essentially going to be adjusting the spread away, like the shape of that fall off from the cavity out to the uncurved surfaces. And now if I go ahead and unisolate that, right? So we can see it's building up that dirt in those cavity areas. So already you guys can see how this has a lot of powerful application to it. So let's go ahead and solo it again. This number of samples is going to be the quality of it. So while I'm updating this really quickly, and trying to get iterations, I want to make sure it's pretty low. But if I want like a really high quality look to it and really smooth, then I might want to increase these samples later on. The spread fall off, like I said, are just going to control how it falls off from those cavity areas. This part right here, the direction's a little harder to understand, but it's essentially going to be controlling which parts are masked and which parts aren't masked. In this case, we're masking out the inside, so now it's like making everything on the outside white. And you just have to play with these fall offs, kind of like the Pixar remap. You just have to kind of adjust these until you get like the map you really like. And you can with everything else, you can get it to a range that you like, but it's not in quite the right value range from black to white. And we can just use a remap node to increase the contrast if I wanted to. And then I have that both, which is going to be factoring for both of them. But by default, it's going to be masking out the outside and giving us a white on the inside. Okay, so that's going to be that curvature node, or dirt node. The curvature node is going to detect sharp changes in curvature. So as if a polygons or an area of polygons changes direction really quickly, it's going to have a mask to it. And then those areas like here where it's relatively flat, it's not going to be masked. So let's go ahead and plug that one in. So I'll plug that there and plug that one here. And let's take a look at this. So you can kind of start to see it. So we're just going to go ahead and play around with these settings a little bit so we can get a better result. So here we go. So this max distance is essentially going to adjust how far away from those edges it's going to detect. Let's just set that to 0.2 or something really low. So really low, it doesn't spread very far. And as we go higher, it spreads out more and more. Bias is just going to be kind of almost like the threshold, where it's going to be looking for a mid value and adjusting that mid value. Same thing with these thresholds. It's going to be favoring the convex, right? So the outward, like kind of bending outward or forward surfaces, and then concave, the bending in the cavities. And so it's just going to kind of mask those out. So you can see that this is like a seam right here. And when I do that concave threshold, that disappears now. And this is a rounded surface right here, and so is this edge right here. So if we bring that convex up, those both disappear. And then we also have a gain, so you can actually make it brighter or darker. Something you probably wouldn't do very often, I don't think. But again, I would probably, if I was doing this, let's set that max distance a little bit higher, and then I'm actually going to lose the convex a little bit. Actually, no, we need that convex, because that's the whole point, is getting those exposed edges. But I would, instead of doing the output game, I would do, and you can see you can actually only output the convex or the concave. So that's pretty cool. So instead of doing the output game, I probably would just do, again, a remap node, so I have full control over my values. And then we unisolate it, and that's what it looks like. So if you guys have ever used the smart masks or baked your mesh maps in Substance Painter, this is the same concept. It's generating masks or images based on your geometry. Okay, and last is going to be the facing ratio. I covered this in another video, but I'll just mention it again. So the facing ratio is essentially going to be creating a mask based on the direction of the polygon relative to a certain input. So in this case, it's the camera. So let's take a look at this. So what it's doing is it's checking each polygon against its direction and the camera's direction. And if they're the same, like they're kind of facing each other, it's white. And if they are actually facing away from each other, it gives you a black image. So if I inverted it, see those front-facing faces are black now, and those side edges are white. And this is based on the camera. You can base it on a direction. You can actually input something like a locator. And so you can actually get this facing ratio that, you know, like almost like a fake light based on a 3D object in the scene. So in this case, it's taking the X coordinate, or actually the Y coordinate. Let's turn off that invert. It's actually this way. So it's pointing up. If the polygons are pointing up in the scene, then they're white. If they're pointing away, like perpendicular to up and down, like left and right, forward, back, then it turns black. I could do the same thing with the Z, right, which is probably going to look very similar to the camera-based one. And let's do the X value, right? Set that one. So now it's left and right. So let's set that back to camera. So it's nice. This is kind of like the Fresnel mode with the specular. So you know how the front facing specular and the edge specular is a different value. This is kind of the same concept, and we can use that gamma to kind of control the fall off. And then where I showed this earlier was with that incandescent light bulb example, is you could use this to make the inside really hot and then the outside cooler, so it feels like it has a hot core to it, and it's more dimensional instead of just the whole object glowing the same. So we'll go back out here, and you can kind of get a sense of what that feels like. And actually, let me show you really quickly. I'll use that black. Actually, no. Yeah, let's do it. Actually, let me pause it really quick, and I'll just set up that emission. Here we go. So it looks a little goofy, but you can see I'm using that Pixar black body to get that high exposure color. I could just use a manual color, but I can come in here and crank that exposure and it's just going to adjust those values for me and then set the temperature relative to kind of like real life color values that you get in lights. So let's just set that back down to a lower value. And then I have for the edges like a darker orange color. And we're just using that Pixar facing ratio to make it so that those front facing polygons are getting that hotter color. So it's just like a little fake, not something you should use all the time. In a lot of cases, you should just use an actual light source. But that Pixar facing ratio gives you that edge to face control. Okay, the last nodes I want to take a look at are math nodes. So I'm not going to go in using them just because this is already a long enough video. Apologize for that. But we have our arithmetic node. If I can spell arithmetic right, Pixar arithmetic. This is going to be like the Maya's multiply, divide, add, subtract nodes. So it's taking float values and you can perform a math operation on them. So for instance, I'll just show you really quickly. So let's say I take on that blend, I set a top color value to, let's bring that saturation down. The top color value is going to be, I don't know, 0.2. And then that bottom color is going to be 0.5, right? And so let's go ahead and take a look at this with all inputs, outputs. I'll take that bottom color and add it to the top color. And you can see it's adding, or it's actually, this is multiplying 0.2 to 0.5. If I change that to add, it's going to add those. So then the result RGB is going to be 0.7, 0.7, 0.7. So super helpful if you need to just shift or offset numbers or values. We also have dot product. So we can have this node that will take the dot product. Again, not going to really go into here. I'm doing that. And then the Pixar cross product. So if for any reason you needed to get the dot product or cross product between two values, you could use either in those nodes. So something that I don't even know if it shows up anymore. So they used to have I typed in SCX, but SCX expressions. Yes. So SC expressions, there's a node that used to be called SC expressions. And what you would do is you could bring in inputs, and it's just like a little node where you can write like a little function, kind of like a little snippet of code, kind of. And so they've actually gotten rid of that. So now they recommend you use the OSL shading language, or using something like the arithmetic node or the dot product or cross product node to get your results if you want to do a little funky stuff of just adding values or subtracting values or multiplying or dividing or whatever. Okay, anyways, so that's a lot of different nodes. This isn't at all comprehensive, of course. I recommend everybody try these things out, play around with them. Like you can see here, this is all built with procedural nodes. Just used, for instance, in this one, I just did a layered material between gold and black. And use that Phasor noise to get some like displacement going on. And then I used like a vertical ramp shader to put this like caked mud on his feet. So you can do a lot of really fun stuff. And so just try all those nodes out and play around with it and see what you can make. And that's it for me.